The Linux Code of Conduct Board has officially banned a developer, the developer of the bcachefs file system, for insufficient groveling. That's how best I can term it. What this means is that all code changes from that developer, which is the primary developer of bcachefs, of which includes a large amount of code that's already been submitted, will be rejected no matter how much it is needed or how beneficial it would be for Linux users from Linux Kernel version 6.13, the one that is now being worked on. That is insane. That means that the Linux kernel is now making decisions about what code to include in the Linux kernel itself, not based on technical merit, not based on how much it is needed or how beneficial it would be or how good of an idea it would be from an engineering perspective, but they are basing it entirely on whether or not the Code of Conduct Board is happy with the person who submitted the code. That's not a joke. That's an actual thing that's happening, and it's not even an exaggeration. I'm going to read an email to you from Dan Williams at Intel.com. So Dan Williams, the Intel employee that apparently is on the Code of Conduct Board, wrote this email on Friday afternoon. Kent Overstreet is the developer who got himself banned. The Code of Conduct Committee received reports about your conduct in this email discussion. Here's a link to where the violation took place. So I'm going to read that for you in a second. Our community works on trust and respect and has agreed to abide by the Code of Conduct. And he links to the Code of Conduct. And by the way, several people besides Kent in here are in direct violation of that Code of Conduct, but they're not getting banned and their code's not getting rejected. Just this one guy. Interesting. I continue. The Code of Conduct Committee has determined that your written abuse of another community member required action on our part to repair the damage to the individual and the community. You took insufficient action to restore the community's faith in having otherwise productive technical discussions without the fear of personal attacks. That's funny to me on multiple levels, not least of which is the fact that the Linux kernel mailing list is famous in all corners of computer world for being a generally abusive place, including from Linus Torvalds, who regularly, including recently, goes on there to abuse people, to tell people that they are really stupid, to grow a brain and read a book, and etc., 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 as well as directly attacking people for their ethnicity and nationality. All of which are direct violations of the Linux kernel Code of Conduct. Linus is not being punished. No one else is being punished. Just the guy who didn't do any of those things. The guy who was a little bit rude and then worked it out with the person who he was being rude about, he's being punished. Weird. Following the Code of Conduct interpretation process, the TAB has approved the following recommendation. Restrict Kent Overstreet's participation in the kernel development process during the kernel 6.13 kernel development cycle. Scope: decline all pull requests from Kent Overstreet during the Linux 6.13 kernel development cycle. So basically what they're saying is, because we don't like what you said and you didn't apologize hard enough, you took insufficient action, therefore you're out. You're tossed out. You cannot contribute code. So Kent Overstreet went over to Patreon, where he's got a little Patreon set up, and blogged about it. Update: no bcachefs updates for 6.13 confirmed. This is from 2 days ago. Fixes will have to come from my personal repository. This came just as the Code of Conduct Board seemed to be relenting, and we started to be having a public conversation. Now that's been cut off. And I think after the private correspondence we had, their action was dishonest. Here's what I wrote to Michael way back in September, because yes, I was out of line, and yes, that did need to be addressed, but I don't think public mea culpas are the best way to do that. I do hope something good can come out of this. So Kent Overstreet had a conversation with another developer where, hold on, let me scroll down to it. He said, and I quote, I am not your assistant to be tasked and search through lore archives. Find one if you need that. Anyway, if you read the email and even tried to understand what is written there rather than immediately started shouting a response, then you would have noticed I have put actual arguments here. You are free to disagree with them and lay down your arguments. You have to decide to... so I don't think you'll be doing that again, etc. There was a few other emails in there. Kent got a little bit rude at a few points, but it was nothing, oh my gosh, code of conduct problem wise, right? It was just a little bit rude. And then after they had that back and forth, Kent Overstreet apologized and made a statement onto the Linux Kernel mailing list that he and the person he was having the argument with worked it out. But that wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough. So the Linux Kernel Code of Conduct Board decided to meet and find a way to publicly flog and punish Michael and punish all Linux users as well, because now you can't use that code. It's just, you can't do it because they're mad at Michael, or mad at Kent. I would like to also point out once again that the Contributor Covenant Code of Conduct, which has been adopted as the official code of conduct by the Linux kernel, has multiple statements in there that the Linux kernel leadership, including the Linux Foundation itself, Linus Torvalds, Greg Crowe-Hartman, and all of them have repeatedly violated in extreme ways, and yet face absolutely no repercussions. Quote, participation in our project and our community, a hassle-free experience for everyone, regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, sex characteristics, gender, blah, 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 level of experience, education, socioeconomic status, nationality, personal appearance, or religion, etc., blah, 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 blah. You may remember that the Linux kernel officially kicked out people who seemed too Russian, who were either living in Russia or had Russian email addresses or Russian-sounding names. They got removed from the maintainers files, basically meaning that they were no longer maintainers of significant portions of the Linux kernel. This happened just very recently. Now, there's very good reasons for why that could happen. President Biden issued an executive order that is limiting the ability for GPL'd projects based in the United States to work with Russian developers. However, they're still violating it, and Linus Torvalds himself went on an anti-Russian rant that was basically made it clear that they would ban Russians even if that executive order wasn't there. He made it clear that no matter what, he's not letting Russians back into the project. That was Linus's words. Is that in violation of the code of conduct? Obviously, by these simple words in front of us. Of course it is. It's discriminating against someone on both ethnicity and nationality, so duh, it is. I should also point out that you have to use welcoming and inclusive language within the Linux kernel project, which clearly Linus does not. Being respectful of differing viewpoints and experiences. Now, clearly these individuals were not being respectful of Kent Overstreet's viewpoints or experiences. Now, I should point out that I don't know Kent Overstreet. I have no built-in desire to or need to defend Kent Overstreet here. I'm simply looking at this as an outside observer and saying, this is nuts. Gracefully accepting constructive criticism. Now, interestingly, Kent Overstreet repeatedly provided constructive criticism. At least that's what it appeared to be from an outsider vantage point, and he was banned for doing so. I've seen multiple people offer constructive criticism of things that Linus has said, and Linus has attacked them and told them the equivalent of, they're retarded. I mean, he just goes on an assault against people and tells them to read a book and learn something for once. Learn about history, why don't you, right? He does this regularly. So is it graceful? No. Should he be banned from doing any work on the Linux kernel for at least a certain amount of time? According to the Linux kernel board, the Code of Conduct board, yes. Linus Torvalds should not be allowed to work on the Linux kernel according to the Linux kernel Code of Conduct board. Of course, that's not going to happen, right? And it's not just Linus. I point out Linus because he's the king and he regularly violates the code of conduct. But so many of the top level maintainers of the Linux kernel do as well. The fact that they're singling out this one developer is absolutely peculiar. Another item, you have to, in the Linux kernel, show empathy towards other community members. I'm not seeing any empathy towards Kent Overstreet here. Now, you may say, well, Kent Overstreet, he's abrasive and he says things that make people grumpy. Well, okay, that may be, but does that mean that you don't have to follow the code of conduct rules anymore because you don't like Kent Overstreet? No, I mean, according to the code of conduct rules, there's no, you can't discriminate against someone based on ethnicity, nationality, and you have to be respectful and all that, unless you don't like them and you feel like their attitudes are grouchy, and then you can do whatever you want to them. You can just attack them and then ban them. Like, that's not in here. So it's fascinating that this is all going on. What happens going forward is going to be interesting to see, because I mean, Kent Overstreet, he's the primary guy behind bcachefs. Now, if bcachefs is now off to the side, and if you want to get the updates, which he already has many of, he submitted them, they were sitting there waiting, but they're rejected because they don't like him, right? Not because the code's bad, they just don't like him, right? So now we're going to have, if you want to use bcachefs, the latest, most secure, most feature-filled version, you're now going to have to fork things. Right? You're going to have to go to his repository to build a Linux kernel version with his changes in it. So you're going to have a separate branch of Linux. We're having the same thing happening with the Russian developers that got demoted, essentially. They're still allowed to hop on a mailing list, at least most of them, but they're not allowed to be maintainers of significant portions of the Linux kernel. So they're already talking about creating a fork of the Linux kernel, a hard fork that sits over and is developed primarily with inside Russia, but with any developers around the world that want to work on that fork of Linux. Okay, great. Why is Linux leadership pushing so hard for more forks of Linux? We're not talking about soft forks here. We're not talking about a little development branch. We're talking about hard forks necessitated not because of any coding or technical issues, but necessitated by imposed policies and codes of conduct. That's curious. It's an incredibly curious approach, and it seems to be accelerating. I'm going to be interested to see where this goes. Will, after the 6.13 cycle of the Linux kernel, will they welcome Kent Overstreet's changes? Will they just backpile up and they'll just have one version of the Linux kernel that doesn't get a bunch of updates? Or will this continue onward, right? Because clearly the way things were worded is that they were sad that Kent Overstreet did not take sufficient, he took insufficient actions to apologize, to grovel. He didn't get down on his hands and knees and beg them for forgiveness, is really what the problem is here. And if any of you disagree with that, I would pose this to you. What could he have done short of that would have allowed Kent Overstreet to avoid this calamitous fate? He worked it out with the individual in question. Two people had a disagreement. They worked it out together and told everyone, hey, we worked it out, it's fine. That's not good enough. You have to publicly flog yourself in order to be allowed to continue to work on the Linux kernel, apparently. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating that this is happening. And I've made mention of this multiple times in other places, but this is an ongoing pattern. We're seeing this increasingly happen where people who have moderation abilities within a project, the moderators, code of conduct board members and the like, taking increasingly extreme actions to completely kick out people for just the most mundane seeming of things. Python kicking out developers or contributors for commenting that they thought SNL was funny 40 years ago. And that's it. You're out. Developers on Linux being kicked out for having a mild disagreement with another developer that they worked out and everyone's fine. Really? On the Linux kernel mailing list? The hotbed of Linus attacking people based on their nationality and swearing at people and doing all sorts of crazy stuff? That get banned from there for having a mild, worked out, resolved disagreement? I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it at all. It is individuals within certain positions of power, code of conduct, boards and committees, moderators, etc., who are, maybe they're feeling backed into a corner. Maybe things aren't going well for them. So they're attacking and kicking out anyone who represents the opposition to them. Anyone who doesn't seem to revere their coveted moderator code of conduct status. They're getting kicked out of these projects for the stupidest reasons. And the people that are hurt by this the most are the end users. I mean, this does nothing to help Linux. It makes Linux measurably, demonstrably worse from a technical and user experience perspective. Not to mention the problems with people who are like, well, do I really want to be contributing to a project where they can kick me out at any moment for disagreeing with the wrong person, or for being of the wrong nationality or ethnicity? Because those are all things that happen regularly on the Linux kernel. I mean, there's no positive here. There's no positive for the Linux kernel. It's extraordinarily disappointing to watch. We'll see where it goes from here. I'm going to keep monitoring things. I'll continue to reach out to individuals. I don't expect any response from the Linux Foundation or from Linus or anyone on these issues. They've learned to not talk to or mention Lunduke. That's just something they've learned to do. But I'll keep an eye on it just the same. Thank you to all the Lunduke Journal subscribers who make it possible for me to do this work, commercial free, big tech free, free from the influence of everybody, including the Linux Foundation. And I can just say the truth no matter who it really pisses off. Luckily, there's no code of conduct board that can silence me at the Lunduke Journal. So that's a pretty good thing. So thank you to everyone who makes that work out. I really appreciate it. Go to lunduke.com, click on all the links, RSS feeds for the podcast. There's videos, there's articles. It's all up there at lunduke.com, links to everything. And again, thank you to everyone who makes it possible. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes alike, both y'all, I do declare, end broadcast. Oh, I have to click the button. Where's the button? I found it. Nobody freak out. See you later, everybody.